When the United States and the United Kingdom went to war against each other in 1812, the major land theaters of war were Upper Canada, Michigan Territory, Lower Canada and the Maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island and Cape Breton. Each of the separate British administrations formed regular and fencible units, and both full-time and part-time militia units, many of which played a major part in the fighting over the 2.5 years of the war. Regulars and fencibles. The fencible units were raised on the same terms as regular troops, but liable for service only in North America. Quasi-military units. Two militarized bodies were in existence before any of the Canadian land units that participated in the war were raised. The Indian Department. This consisted of about 100 officers whose purpose was to act as agents, envoys or interpreters to the various native tribes and nations. Many of its personnel took part in actions in which the peoples to whom they were attached participated. They were supposed to wear full dress in action, to prevent them being mistaken for Americans by excited warriors. Indian Department officers were indeed often of mixed native and European ancestry. Some claimed to speak little or no English. The most well-known victory won by natives fighting directly under British command was the Battle of Beaver Dams in 1813. The Provincial Marine. This had been responsible since the late 18th century for military transport and police duties on the Great Lakes. When war broke out, they possessed Lake Ontario Royal George ship, 510 tons, 22 guns. Prince Regent ship, tonnage unknown, 16 guns. Earl of Moira brig, 262 tons, 14 guns. Duke of Gloucester brig, tonnage unknown, 10 guns. Seneca schooner, tonnage unknown. Governor Simcoe schooner, 187 tons, 8 guns. Lake Erie Queen Charlotte ship, 400 tons, 17 guns. Lady Prevost schooner, 230 tons, 13 guns. Hunter brig, 180 tons, 10 guns. In 1812, the efficiency of the Provincial Marine was described as low, not least because its senior officer was over 80 years old. Nevertheless, the Americans initially had nothing to match it, and it played a major part in the victories of General Isaac Brock. It was expanded during the war, and its officers and sailors played valiant parts in the Battle of Lake Erie and the Battle of Plattsburgh. Atlantic provinces. The Royal Newfoundland Fencibles. Although units had been raised in Newfoundland as early as 1795, the regiment which fought in the War of 1812 was officially formed in 1803. Its authorized establishment was 1,000, but it numbered 556 when the war broke out. Many of the regiment's soldiers were expert boatmen, and 5 companies were sent to Upper Canada in 1812 to serve as Marines on the Great Lakes. They fought as such throughout the war, suffering heavy casualties at the Battle of Lake Erie. When not serving aboard ships, the regiment was split up into garrisons and detached companies throughout Upper Canada. A detachment of 90 men from the regiment, with 30 officers and men from the Royal Artillery and 21 sailors of the Royal Navy, opened a trail from York, the provincial capital of Upper Canada, to the Nottawasaga River during the early month of 1814. The detachment subsequently took part in the Battle of Mackinac Island and the engagement on Lake Huron. The unit was disbanded in 1816, though its history and heritage is carried on by the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. As a royal unit, it had blue facings to its red coats. The Nova Scotia Fencibles. The Nova Scotia Fencibles was raised in 1803. The unit had red uniforms with yellow facings. Although posted to Kingston in Upper Canada in 1814, the regiment did not see action and was disbanded in 1816. Half the unit, some 210 officers and other ranks, together with 48 wives and children, were on board the Archduke Charles when it wrecked on 29 May 1816 near Green Island in the St. Lawrence River. The regiment had marched from Kingston to Quebec and had embarked there for Nova Scotia. 4 soldiers, 2 wives, and 2 children lost their lives. All others were saved. Contemporary accounts referred to the regiment as the Royal Nova Scotia Regiment, which had, however, been disbanded some years earlier. The New Brunswick Regiment of Fencible Infantry. This regiment also was raised in 1803. Although established as fencibles, the regiment volunteered for general service, and became the 104th Regiment of Foot in the British Army in 1810. Nevertheless, they served in North America only. They made an epic winter march from Fredericton to Kingston in early 1813. Detachments from the regiment fought at the Battle of Sackett's Harbor, and in the various campaigns on the Niagara Peninsula. The flank companies suffered heavy casualties in a failed storming attempt during the Siege of Fort Erie. The unit was trained in light infantry tactics with the intention of being formally converted to light infantry. Like light infantry units, they used bugles instead of drums to pass commands on the battlefield. There were many skilled axemen and boatmen in the regiment. The pre-war training also emphasized winter maneuvers and amphibious operations. The unit was disbanded in 1817. The red uniforms had buff facings. The regiment is commemorated within the Canadian Army by the Royal New Brunswick Regiment, which also carries the Niagara Battle Honour awarded to the regiment in the aftermath of the conflict. Another unit, also known as the New Brunswick Fencibles, was formed in 1813 to garrison various posts in the Maritime provinces, and was disbanded in 1816. Lower Canada. The Canadian Fencibles first recruited in Scotland in 1803. The Scottish recruits feared that they were about to be crimped for service in India, or other unhealthy posts, and mutinied. Eventually, the unit was recruited from the French-speaking Canadians of Lower Canada. The Light Company fought at the Battle of Chateauguay and the Grenadier Company at the Battle of Le Colomilles. A small detachment fought at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm, and some of the battalion companies served as Marines with the squadron on Lake Champlain. In several raids in 1813. The unit was disbanded in 1816. Its red uniforms had yellow facings. The history and heritage of the Canadian Regiment of Fencible Infantry is carried on in the Canadian Army by the Royal 22E Regiment. Upper Canada. The Glengarry Light Infantry, formed by order of Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost in 1812, recruited from settlements of discharged Scottish soldiers in Glengarry district. Originally intended to wear Highlander uniforms, they wore the dark green uniform with black facings of the Rifle Brigade instead, although they were armed with muskets rather than rifles. Companies and detachments fought in several actions in Upper Canada in 1813, and the whole unit fought at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. The unit specialized in British light infantry tactics and thus was well trained in duties such as skirmishing and concealed sentry duty. While the unit was disbanded in 1816, its modern descendant within the Canadian Army is the Stormont, Dundas and Glengarry Highlanders. A modern reenactment unit is based in Fort Erie, Ontario, on the opposite side of the river from Buffalo, New York. The Michigan Fencibles, a small unit of 45 men raised at Fort Mackinac in 1813. They served in the West, including at the Siege of Prairie du Chien, disbanded in 1815. The unit supposedly had a uniform of red coats with black facings, but given the distance from regular supply sources and the hard conditions in which it served, it is unlikely that they ever presented a uniform appearance. Full-time militia. Various full-time units were formed from members of the militia, although usually intended for garrison duty only. Several units saw action. All such militia units were disbanded very soon after the war ended, and the men returned to the former occupations. Particularly in Upper Canada, ordinary militia contingents could not be kept in the field for long, especially around harvest time of the planting season, when many militia would want to return to work on the farms. This was one reason for the formation of some of the full-time units. Lower Canada. The Canadian Voltiges had slightly anomalous position, in that they were supposedly militia and subject to the militia laws and ordinances, but were listed as a regular unit during the war. They were formed from volunteers from the militia by Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Salaberry in 1812. The Voltiges were trained to a high standard, and fought in several actions, including the Battle of Chateauguay. The unit had a grey uniform, with black facings and equipment. Though the unit contained French-speaking Canadians for the majority, their orders were given in English. Les Voltiges de Quebec perpetuate the history and heritage of the Canadian Voltiges within the Canadian Army. The Frontier Light Infantry, a small unit 2 companies strong, which were listed as the 9th and 10th companies of the Voltiges, but which were administered separately. Most of its men were English-speaking volunteers from the eastern townships. Unlike the French-speaking main body of the Voltiges, they operated alongside a group of Mohawk warriors at La Colla, engaging in running firefights with the Americans during the latter's advance to the mill. The history and heritage of the Frontier Light Infantry is perpetuated within the Canadian Army by the Sherbrooke Hussars. Select embodied militia, formed partly from volunteers, and partly from conscripted men chosen by lot who served for 1 year only. 4 battalions were initially formed early in 1812, followed by a 5th after war was declared, and a 6th in 1813. The 7th and 8th battalions of sedentary embodied militia were formed in Montreal in late 1813 when an American attack was threatened, but were disbanded as soon as the crisis was over. When the select embodied militia units were first formed, they were forced by a shortage of official pattern uniforms to adopt a variety of dress. By late 1813 at the latest, all battalions had been issued red uniforms. The flank companies of the 1st to 4th battalions were detached to form 2 ad hoc light infantry battalions during much of 1813. Part, at least, of the 1st Light Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel George MacDonell, which included the Light Company of the Canadian Fencibles and the Light Companies of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of Select Embodied Militia, and the main body of the 2nd Battalion of the Select Embodied Militia, also fought at the Battle of Chateauguay. The Light Battalions were broken up late in 1813 or in early 1814, except for the 6th Battalion, which garrisoned the citadel of Quebec City. Detachments of all the select embodied militia units saw action in the Montreal-Lake Champlain sectors. Canadian chasseurs. After the 5th Battalion of Select Embodied Militia attracted unfavorable reports in 1814, it was reorganized and reformed as a light infantry unit. The Canadian chasseurs. Several of the flank companies of other Select Embodied Militia battalions which had already seen much service with the light battalions were consolidated into the chasseurs, while the existing personnel of of the 5th Battalion were dispersed among the other battalions. The chasseurs wore substantially the same uniform as the voltiges and were brigaded with them in the campaign in 1814, which ended with the Battle of Plattsburgh. This unit should not be confused with the independent companies of foreigners, which were raised from among French prisoners of war and served in Chesapeake Bay in 1813, being responsible for several acts of looting and rape, and were given the title P. Canadian Chasseurs by Major General Sidney Beckwith without authorization. The Quebec Volunteers, a small volunteer unit which may have been merged into the 6th Select Embodied Militia Battalion. The Compagnie des Guides, a small company of volunteer cavalry. The Canadian Light Dragoons, a mounted unit, also known as Coleman's Troop after its commander. It saw much action in Upper Canada, though mainly as pickets and dispatch riders rather than cavalry. The Dorchester Provincial Light Dragoons, another volunteer horsed unit. The Royal Militia Artillery, a small detachment who volunteered for full-time service with units of the Royal Artillery. It participated in the Battle of Chrysler's Farm. The Corps of Provincial Royal Artillery Drivers, volunteers who served as drivers for units of the Royal Artillery. Its personnel may also have been paid for providing their own draft animals. The Corps of Canadian Voyageurs, originally raised by William Mackay from among the boatmen of the Northwest Fur Company, to move military supplies west from Quebec and Montreal. The Corps numbered about 400, and was involved in several skirmishes with American raiders during the winter of 1812 to 1813. In 1813, responsibility for transport was transferred to the Commissariat, and the Corps was disbanded and reformed as the Provincial Commissariat Voyages. During the war, members of this corps took part in actions on the St. Lawrence River, and journeyed far up the Ottawa River to reach Lake Huron. They had no recognized uniform and wore practical clothing as the season required. They also determinedly resisted any attempt to make them conform to any standard of parade ground drill. So vital was transportation that in 1814, when large numbers of British troops were sent to Canada, Sir George Prevost suggested converting all his select embodied militia to boatmen and voyageurs. This plan met with disapproval from every Canadian officer. Upper Canada. Most militia units in Upper Canada formed flank companies, who served on a more regular full-time basis than the ordinary members of the militia, and were sometimes termed volunteers. They drilled every weekend, as opposed to the bulk of the militia who were required to turn out for training only twice a year in peacetime. Such flank companies took part in the Battle of Queenston Heights and other actions on the Niagara Peninsula. The Incorporated Militia Battalion. This was formed from volunteers from the militia in 1813. Originally scattered in several garrisons, the battalion concentrated at York, before seeing action on the Niagara Peninsula. The uniform of redcoats had green facings. Although issues of uniforms were erratic and not all the companies would have had the official recognized uniform, the entire unit fought at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. The unit was always used as a body of skirmishing light infantry, and late in 1814, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond proposed to give the battalion the same uniform as the Glengarry Light Infantry in the modern Canadian Army, because the battalion of Incorporated Militia was recruited from various parts of Upper Canada. It is perpetuated by today by 4 Ontario-based units: the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, the Queen's York Rangers, the Brockville Rifles, and the Princess of Wales Own Regiment. These units all carried the Niagara Battle Honour awarded to the battalion in the aftermath of the war. Caldwell's Western Ranges, known as Caldwell's Ranges, after the commander, noted Loyalist and Indian trader William Caldwell. The unit was a rather small one, probably not more than 50 men. Nominally organized as 2 companies, they often worked in conjunction with the Indian Department and fought dispersed alongside the Indians. The unit, or parts of it, fought at the Battle of Moraviantown, the Battle of Longwoods, the Battle of Lundy's Lane, and in several actions on the Niagara Peninsula. There is little authenticated documentation as to the clothing and equipment carried by the Rangers. It is known that the Rangers were issued a bucket cap, grey woolen trousers and a green woolen tunic, and a black leather bayonet belt and cartridge box. This equipment was issued only once. After that, they were told to resupply themselves from the enemy. In summer, they would wear white cotton instead of woolen trousers. It is not known with which model musket they were issued, although some scholars have suggested that they would have been captured American Springfield Model 1795 musket, while some others contend they may have used trade muskets instead. The Rangers found that the standard infantry bayonet was too cumbersome for bush fighting and often used hatchets instead. The Rangers were recruited locally from Essex County and enrolled into the militia, but not permitted to quit the British service at the leisure as sedentary militia could. Fought in Malden National Historic Site has in recent years employed summer students for the recreated unit at the park and regional reenactments. There is also a modern reenacting unit that recreates the Rangers. They are based out of Amherstburg, Ontario, and work in conjunction with Fort Malden. The Rangers are perpetuated in the modern Canadian Army by the Essex and Kent Scottish Regiment. The Loyal Kent Volunteers, a company of volunteer militiamen formed in Kent County on the 25th of November 1813. Fought in the Battle of Longwoods. This unit is perpetuated in the Canadian Army by the Essex and Kent Scottish Regiment. The Loyal Essex Volunteers, another volunteer militia company, sometimes called the Essex Rangers, embodied in Essex County about March 1814. This unit is perpetuated in the Canadian Army by the Essex and Kent Scottish Regiment. The Mississippi Volunteers, an ad hoc unit, recruited on the spot from voyageurs and traders during the attack on Prairie du Chien in 1814. There was also a Mississippi Volunteer Artillery detachment. The Provincial Dragoons, also known as Merritt's Troop, after its first commander, Captain William Hamilton Merritt, served on the Niagara Peninsula. The Provincial Dragoons would later be seen as an ancestral unit of the 2nd, 10th Dragoons, which currently exists today as 10th Field Battery, 56th Field Artillery Regiment, RCA in St. Catharines, Ontario. The Incorporated Artillery Company, a volunteer artillery unit. The Provincial Artillery Drivers, as in Lower Canada, volunteers who served as drivers for the Royal Artillery. They and the draft animals were used to convert a detachment of Royal Artillery into a car brigade, essentially horse artillery, under Captain W. H. Jackson. The detachment was stationed at Fort George and played a major part in the Battle of Queenston Heights. 2 more such detachments were subsequently formed at Kingston. The Corps of Provincial Artificers attached to the Royal Sappers and Miners. Some of its other ranks were Negroes, many of whom had formed Captain Runchie's company of colored men at the Battle of Queenston Heights.